The agenda this week heard from parents on what they say to their kids about anti-Black racism, learned how economists untangle data, and spoke to political scientist Francis Fukuyama about liberalism. The agenda's Week in Review begins looking at the rise of online exploitation of children.
Leanna, let's get to this. Why are we seeing increases in cyber crimes targeting youth in Ontario and across Canada, in your view?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons, Steve. We're really in the perfect storm right now. When you look at the epidemic of COVID, kids spending more time online, isolated. You also have access to platforms where we see adults having free access to children within those environments. And also you have, child development. You have kids who are exploring their own sexuality. They're, spending time online. And we have very sophisticated networks of individuals who commit crimes against children. So basically, it really should not be a surprise to us. And then on top of it, what we have is an unregulated internet.
All right, Nora, can I get you to follow up on the COVID angle? How much has COVID been responsible for the uptick that we've seen?
I think COVID has complicated and increased the risk for a number of reasons. Before COVID, children had multiple outlets or opportunities to socialize. They had friends that they could go out with and hang out with, but we had to put an end to that during COVID. And so children were isolated and quite literally left to their own devices, which resulted in them starting to, experiment much more online and probably engage in riskier behavior without perhaps gaining a full appreciation for the potential consequences. So when you have inabilities to engage socially or in person, they're trying to maintain that social engagement or interaction online using different platforms.
It's another unhealthy byproduct of COVID that perhaps some people didn't consider.
Yes, it is.
Okay, Michael, lots of terms here that we need some clarification around. For example, the offense of self-exploitation. What is that?
Yeah, so essentially self-exploitation is we are having kids as young as 4 years old. They are on their electronics and they're on certain social media platforms. And as Leanna said, sometimes it could be that they're experimenting with themselves, or they inadvertently post images or videos of themselves online.
There are 4-year-olds with their own iPhones?
iPhones, their own accounts, their own email accounts. They are very knowledgeable and very advanced to what you would think a 4-year-old would know about the internet and devices.
Do you have any advice to parents on the advisability of getting their 4-year-old an iPhone and an Instagram account to boot?
I would not recommend it. And those that do have access to devices, I would recommend overseeing them quite a bit.
Okay, Leanna, another expression here, sextortion. What is that?
Basically, it's blackmail. What we're seeing is kids who are being targeted, they're being coerced or tricked into giving a sexual image of themselves, typically is what's happening, or video. What we know is we've got very sophisticated organized crime networks that are making a lot of money in this capacity, and we have kids who are completely being duped. They think a young boy might think they're talking to a pretty girl, and basically within a short time frame, they're exchanging images. What happens very, very quickly is it turns to demands for money. And many of these organized groups are outside of North America, so it makes it incredibly complicated for law enforcement efforts. But more importantly, these kids don't stand a chance. And so it's really, really concerning. And since July alone, we've had 1,700 reports come into us about sextortion.
Oh, I got more on this. Hang on. Sheldon, follow me here, if you would. Middle of page 2. We have a lot more facts to introduce to the record here. Stats gathered by the Canadian Centre for Child Protection about the increase in youth being sextorted, as the term goes. These numbers gathered between July 2022 and January 2023, so 6-month period. Cybertip.ca currently receives an average of 70 sextortion reports per week. The National Tip Line received more than 1,700 sextortion reports in total. 91% of sextortion victims are male. Typically, boys are extorted for money Girls are extorted for images. Sextortion demands for money often come from international organized criminal networks, as Leanna was telling us. 79% of sextortion incidents occurred on Instagram or Snapchat. Okay, Nora, we need some advice here. If you find yourself the victim of a sextortion attempt, what do you do?
I think the most important thing is ensuring that they have a trusted individual that they could speak to. And I think one of our biggest efforts is to really remove the shame and blame that's associated with making mistakes. These are children and youth who are, as Leanne mentioned, experimenting, and they're experimenting in areas, in non-traditional areas. And the internet being what it is and being unregulated, it creates a whole other level of risk. So I think what we need to do is really focus on providing caregivers, parents, teachers, the tools they need to be able to engage in these conversations, to be able to identify these situations and proactively engage with children and youth on some of the risks and dangers associated with it.
The talk evolves over years, over time, right? But at elementary school, it was the talk about how to keep himself, understanding that Black boys in school, diagnosis around ADHD, everything in school becomes a problem for Black boys. Behaviors that are typically routine for other kids becomes problematic for Black boys, so they become disordered within the school system. So I had to have those talks early on. But one of the things in the talk, I also think it's important that I have the talk with teachers so they understand what to expect of my Black boy.
So the talk's not just for kids, it's for others.
Yes, because I think for too long we focused on, we need to keep our Black boys safe, our Black children safe, and that's unfortunate that we have to engage in this level of protection and safety just to keep them alive.
And we should say your son is one of the top divers in the whole country.
Yes,
he's potentially going to be an Olympic level diver someday.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
Yet I'm having the talk because even his successes as an elite athlete doesn't keep him safe.
Okay, Earl, we've set the table for you here, so come on in here and tell us about, in fact, if you could build on Kathy's answer, how the talk evolves over the years as children go from elementary school to high school, etc.
Yeah, well, I think, as a psychologist, we oftentimes talk about the need to be age appropriate with those conversations. So I think a big piece of it is, as kids are younger, you may be giving them really basic, minimal information. And as they get older, you can have more of a dialogue and conversation with them about their own perceptions and experiences with the world. And that's something that I oftentimes really talk with parents about, is that you don't want to always sort of give your side or position on what you think happens in terms of racial bias, and that it really is helpful and important to understand how they see the world. So I think, a point that was talked about earlier is, am I putting this fear in my child that may not be present when I have this conversation? And so I think, one of the things that's really helpful is really opening up that dialogue to get their perceptions. What has been their experiences based upon their skin color at school, in the community, playing sports, and then be able to go from there to give them the tools that they need to be able to navigate those different experiences that they may be having based upon those racial differences.
Valine, could you pick up on the education angle as well that Kathy raised, namely that Black kids may not be allowed to get away with as much bad behavior as white kids are allowed to get away with in schools.
Yes.
And it may be a case that administrations or teachers see white kids acting a certain way and they don't, they say, well, that's ADHD and we have to, take a clinical approach to that, whereas it may be a more disciplinary approach for a Black kid.
Sure.
How do you work that out?
Kathy made a very good point in making sure that you are present and you speak to your teachers, be involved in every aspect of their conversations, and also making sure that even as a collective, speaking to other parents as well. Anytime that there is any kind of discord in the classroom, they need to know who you are, right? I think, too, a lot of Black children overall, I'm going to say girls as well, because, of course, I had the talk. You did not have the talk, but I had the talk.
From your parents?
From my parents, namely my father. Part of that is also, you spoke about behavior, but it's also academia. You have to work harder. You have to make sure that you work 3 times, 5 times, 10 times harder than your counterpart.
Because?
Because of the color of your skin.
Because the assumption is there's systemic racism in the school system.
That's correct. And you have to make sure that you are seen. You are able to achieve the same things that everyone else in the class is achieving. You're able to show that you are capable, you're competent, you can excel in all areas of the academia or curriculum as any other child.
Kathy, how do you be present as a parent and advocate for your child effectively while at the same time not being labeled or targeted by the administration or the teachers of the school as that parent who complains all the time?
I think it's really a tricky situation. We talk about presence and advocating for our children. Let's be clear that not all Black parents have the capacity or the ability to be present and advocate. What we see oftentimes is many of our Black parents in densely populated areas, they are working minimum wages, multiple jobs, can't make it to parent-teacher meetings, can't give the phone call during school hours, and those kids get dinged. Those parents get labeled. It is not that they are unwilling or negligent of their children. It is that they do not have the capacity. But how do you balance between being a strong advocate for your child and not being that parent? I'm okay with being that parent.
That's right.
You don't mind, because if it's in the advocacy of your child,
Yes.
be that parent.
That's right, because the cost is too great to not be that parent.
This is a graph. It's a line graph from the years 2013 to now. It's about wages and costs, and it looks at a number of factors, wages, labor force survey, accounts, payrolls, hours, productivity, and so on. And what we see in this chart, that with the exception of a big blip when COVID started, up, and then a big blip down as we got about a year into COVID, it's a pretty flat line. Wages basically haven't done anything for the last decade. But then we saw this tweet from the University of Waterloo economist Mikhail Skuterud, who said the following: claim was real hourly wage growth has been stagnant. His chart shows 22% growth over 23 years. That's a 0.9% annual growth rate over 23 years. Real GDP per capita grew by 27% over same period. And he concludes, I don't think this is what people have in mind when they hear stagnant. And this graph shows the same line, but it's not flat. It looks more, well, it looks like a kind of a short mountain, but it's going up from sort of bottom to top. It suggests wages are certainly more robust than the previous chart. And again, this chart goes back to 1998 to present day. So it goes further back and it shows a longer period of time. So we ask ourselves, what does all this mean? Who's right? Armin, start us off.
Oh, okay. First things first, wages were stagnant for about 20 years in the wake of the 81-82 recession and the 90-91 recession, almost zero wage growth. The first chart you showed roughly 3% wage growth every year, roughly, until the pandemic hit. And that chart comes from the Bank of Canada, which is really worried about wage price spirals taking off. In other words, people trying to catch up their wages to higher prices, which is the first time we've seen it since the 1980s. And we're not seeing any evidence as yet that wages are starting to spike in their pace of growth. Mikhail Skoudarud's chart starts in 1998. That's roughly when wage stagnation ended. And he is right. It's the same as the previous chart, which just the Bank of Canada was just measuring annual growth, year over year growth every year, and it didn't really budge. But he is also right. Every year, if wages grow about 3%, on average, then you are going to see a fairly interesting growth over time. You have to compare that, of course, to inflation. And you also have to take a look at whose wages are growing over time. And I guess that's the end of what I have to contribute in this opening, Wally.
Okay. Trevin, pick that up if you will, because I appreciate Armin says basically the graphs say the same thing. But I look at one graph and it's a pretty flat line, and I look at the other graph and it looks like a ski hill. So how can they be saying the same thing?
Yeah, I would agree, is that both graphs generally show the same thing. So even though in the first graph, the line may look flat, it's actually above zero. And so it's showing the growth rate each year being around 2 to 3%, meaning that wages are growing each year at a relatively consistent rate before the pandemic. Now, what we've seen since the pandemic, particularly in the last couple of years, is that even though wages themselves have been increasing still, they haven't been able to keep pace with inflation and price increases. So wages are going up, but you can't buy what you used to be able to buy for that price. And probably where a number of economists would disagree is what happens from here, whether we go to that pre-pandemic trend or whether things have changed going forward.
Okay. Benjamin, you've seen the two graphs. What do you pull from this?
Yes, so let me share with you some trade secrets. When you want to focus on something, you lower the scale, and the scale is very narrow, and then all of a sudden you see this mountain, and vice versa. You can zoom out, and then you don't see a flat. Those two charts basically telling you exactly the same thing.
But they don't look anything alike.
I know, and that's why you have to pay attention what it is. One of them is year-over-year rate of change. The rate of change. The other one is the level. The rate of change, as long as it is higher than zero, the level goes up. So focus on what they are giving you, year-over-year change or the level. It's basically the same chart, the same information. Extremely important, and what's not in this chart, is who is getting this increase in wages or not. And we have to remember that this is average wage. Now, an advice, the minute you hear the word average, be careful. Because average is very confusing, because it's a composition of labor as well. If you have less people working in low-paying industries, as we have seen during the pandemic, actually the average wage is going up because you remove low wage, low productivity people from the equation. All of a sudden, we are more productive during the pandemic. No, we are not. But because of the fact that, unfortunately, most of the people that lost their jobs were low productivity, low wage, all of a sudden the stock was actually high wage, high productivity. Be careful here. You have to look at the composition. And then, okay, who is getting the increase? Low wage, high wage, the average is very misleading.
We really have to drill down deeper to that next level down to really understand what's going on here then.
And that's why there's no clear, simple answer. The chart tells you only part of the story.
Your fear that accomplished liberal societies feature, quote, a lack of purpose or a spiritual emptiness. Can you give us some advice on how we might deal with those two problems?
Well, that goes to the essence of a liberal society. In a liberal society, we agree that we're going to disagree about the most important things. We're not going to define our common aims in terms of a religious idea or a very strong national idea, because we live in pluralistic societies where people are able to do what they want. And I think that, the degree of pluralism that we have, especially here in North America, is such that it's hopeless to think that we're going to ever, march in the same direction in terms of basic religious values or we're not simply one ethnicity. And I think that, in many respects, that becomes a strength. It's kind of a cliche to say that our strength is in our diversity, but in fact, the ability to absorb immigrants, to actually create a society out of, a very complex texture of ethnicities, races, and the like, is, something that I think becomes necessary as your economy and your society develop. And so, I think we find in a democratic society that our communal satisfaction is not given to us by the fact that we're like one people marching in one direction, but we still have community. You know, we can still exercise religious freedom. We can join the church of our choice. We can join private associations. You know, we have many alternatives for a communal life. It's simply not going to be one single direction dictated by one single person at the top. And I think that, you know, is a much more desirable expression of our intrinsically social natures, you know, than an authoritarian regime provides.
I have to tell you, from this side of the border, I think it's fair to say most Canadians looking south at what's transpired in the United States over the past, well, let's say decade, but really I think most Canadians would say over the last 5 years, is a country that has been, you know, taken hostage by the extremists of both parties, probably more so by the extreme wing of the Republican Party than the Democrats. But having said that, as I watched the State of the Union last night and I saw a president of the United States from the Democrat Party reaching out to shake hands with the Speaker of the House, the newly elected Speaker of the House, who's a Republican, and then after that paying homage to the longest-serving Senate Minority Leader in American history, and Mitch McConnell, that to me looked like potentially the beginning of a moment of more moderation and more reaching out. I don't want to be naive about this, but how did you see it?
I hope that I hope that that's correct. You know, I do think that the Republican Party has basically followed Donald Trump off of a cliff. You know, the future of that party and of the country as a whole cannot lie in a preoccupation with this supposed stolen election back in 2020. And I think we've seen plenty of evidence that a lot of Republicans are kind of sick of that and think that they've got another agenda that is not being addressed as a result of that. And so I do think that, you know, you're going to get a different kind of Republican candidate in the future that hopefully will return to, you know, the kind of real policy differences that existed between Republicans and Democrats that were serious, you know, differences of opinion about what we ought to do about immigration, about jobs, about a lot of different issues, and not this preoccupation, you know, with kind of, you know, the psychoses of one particular individual that's been leading the party. So, you know, maybe that will play out over the next couple of years before the 2024 election. We'll have to see. I guess the other thing, you know, since I was in Canada recently, I do think that part of the reason that the U.S. is so different from Canada really does have to do with its racial history. I've always thought that, you know, if somehow the Civil War had ended up differently and the South had gone off as a separate country, the United States, the rest of the United States would actually look a lot like Canada. But that didn't happen. We stayed a single country. And I think that that racial legacy has really very much shaped the politics and certainly lies at the base of a lot of the polarization that we are experiencing today. You know, the whole controversy over wokeness, which really started as a disagreement about how to interpret that racial history. And so, you know, our situations are different. I think you Canadians are perfectly right in scratching your heads and wondering, you know, what the hell's going on south of the border. I do that myself, but, you know, here we are.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.